In 2018, Shannon Watts and her two daughters disappeared from their Colorado home. Her husband, Chris Watts, pleaded for their safe return. But what unfolded next shocked the nation. This is the true story of lies, betrayal, and a family tragedy that captivated the world. August 13, 2018, began like any other summer Monday in Frederick, Colorado. But by midday, a mother, her two young daughters, and an unborn child were missing, and nothing about that day would ever be considered normal again. Shannon Watts, 34 years old and 15 weeks pregnant, had just returned from a business trip to Arizona. She arrived home in the early hours of the morning, dropped off by her friend and co-worker, Nicole Atkinson. Nicole had noticed Sean and seemed tired, maybe even stressed, but nothing out of the ordinary. Later that morning, Nicole became concerned when Sean and missed a scheduled OB/GYN appointment. Calls and texts went unanswered. She wasn't responding on social media either, which was unusual for Shannon. She was known for being extremely active online, especially sharing updates about her daughters, Bella and Celeste. Around noon, Nicole drove to the Watts residence. The front door was locked. No one answered. Her car was in the garage, but the house was silent. Panicked, Nicole called Chris Watts, Shannon's husband. He sounded calm, almost too calm, and said Sean and had taken the girls to a friend's house. But he didn't know which one. He was at work and couldn't come home right away. Unconvinced, Nicole called the police. Within minutes, an officer from the Frederick Police Department arrived at the home. Bodycam footage from that moment would later become a critical piece of public evidence. Chris Watts showed up shortly after the officer. His demeanor was casual, smiling, making small talk. He gave permission for officers to enter the home. Inside, things looked normal. Too normal. Shannon's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her phone was still charging in the bedroom. Her shoes sat by the front door. The children's medication was untouched. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. Just a house, frozen in time. Chris gave the officer a tour of the house. In the girls' rooms, the beds were made. Their toys were untouched. The nursery, where Shannon planned to welcome their baby boy, Nico, was still being set up. Outside, a neighbor pulled the officer aside and asked to show him footage from his security camera. It captured Chris backing his truck into the driveway early that morning, something the neighbor said Chris never did. The footage showed him loading something into the truck, but it was hard to make out what. Standing with the officer, Chris watched the footage but seemed distracted, fidgeting. After he left, the neighbor said something that would haunt viewers later. "He's not acting right. I've never seen him like that." Within 24 hours, the case exploded. Shannon and her daughters were officially listed as missing. News crews arrived in Frederick. Social media lit up with theories and calls for help. Chris gave a now infamous TV interview, pleading for his family's return. "I just want them back," he said, voice trembling. "If someone has them, bring them back. This house is not complete without them." But something felt wrong. The emotion in his voice didn't match his body language. Investigators were watching closely, and so was the public. What no one knew yet was that the house was already filled with secrets, and Chris Watts wasn't telling the truth. From the moment Chris Watts appeared on television pleading for the return of his wife and daughters, something felt off. To the public, he seemed strangely calm. To investigators, he seemed rehearsed. Behind the scenes, law enforcement was already growing suspicious. His body language didn't align with his words, and inconsistencies in his story were beginning to emerge. The Frederick Police Department, alongside the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, launched a coordinated investigation. One of the first red flags was Chris's reaction to the search of his home. Most spouses in that situation are desperate, emotional, even frantic. Chris wasn't. He was cooperative, but detached, polite, but guarded. The same questions started forming in the minds of both investigators and viewers across the country. Why isn't he asking more questions? Why isn't he breaking down? Then came the polygraph. On August 15th, just 2 days after the disappearance, Chris agreed to take a lie detector test. The examiner, Tammy Lee, was experienced and methodical. She made Chris feel comfortable. She reassured him that truth would help find his family. The test was administered, and the results were unequivocal. Chris failed. Tammy confronted him gently. "Chris," she said, "this test indicates that you're not being truthful." He didn't deny it. Instead, he broke down. But the story he told was not the full truth. Chris claimed that after Sean returned from her trip, they had an emotional conversation about separating. According to him, Sean became enraged, and in a fit of anger, she killed their daughters. In retaliation, Chris said he killed her. Investigators didn't believe it. His story was full of holes. Sean had no history of violence, no signs of instability. By contrast, Chris had been acting increasingly distant. Phone records and texts retrieved from his devices painted a new picture, one of betrayal. Chris had been having an affair. Her name was Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker. They had started seeing each other just weeks earlier. Texts between them showed that Chris had told Nicole he was separated, finalizing a divorce, and had no children. He was living a double life. Nicole told investigators she had no idea his family was missing until she saw it on the news. Once she learned the truth, she came forward and cooperated fully. Her testimony added a powerful motive. Chris wanted a new life. One without responsibility. One without Sean. Back at the Watts home, forensic teams were working quietly. They found no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. But they did find subtle things, like a sheet missing from the bed, a blanket out of place, a shallow stain on the carpet. The garage security camera confirmed what the neighbor had seen. Chris loading large items into his truck early that morning. One of those items, it would later be revealed, was Shanann's body. Under growing pressure, Chris confessed. In a chilling interview, he admitted to strangling Sean in their bed after a confrontation. He then loaded her body, along with his 2 daughters, still alive at the time, into his truck. He drove them over an hour away to an oil site where he worked. There, in one of the most disturbing revelations of the entire case, he admitted to smothering his daughters and disposing of their bodies in separate oil tanks. He buried Sean in a shallow grave nearby. The details horrified the public. The timeline became clearer, but the motivation remained unfathomable. How could a father do this to his own children? How could a husband erase an entire family in one night? Chris's actions didn't just betray his wife and children. They betrayed an entire community, a nation that had rallied in hope, and countless people who believed his lies. The man who had gone on TV to beg for his family's return was, all along, the one responsible for their deaths. The cracks in the facade had shattered, and the real story was more devastating than anyone had imagined. Chris Watts' confession sent shockwaves through the nation, but for investigators, it was only the beginning of a deeper psychological unraveling. After finally admitting to killing Sean and his daughters, Chris provided more details, each more chilling than the last. What emerged wasn't just a confession of murder. It was the revelation of a man who had meticulously crafted an image of the perfect family man while secretly preparing to destroy everything he had. Chris explained that he and Shannon had argued in their bedroom. She had confronted him about the affair. She knew something was wrong. In his own words, he claimed he snapped. But there was no screaming, no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. Investigators quickly saw this for what it was: premeditation. He had made a decision, and once that decision was made, he acted on it. The real horror began after Shannon was dead. According to Chris, his daughters were still alive when he placed them in the back seat of his truck alongside their mother's lifeless body. For over an hour, he drove with them, Bella 4 and Celeste 3, asking questions, scared, confused. At the oil site, he first buried Shannon in a shallow grave. Then, one by one, he killed his daughters and placed their bodies in separate oil tanks, containers only 8 inches wide. The details were so disturbing that even hardened investigators struggled to process them. What made this even more unsettling was Chris's demeanor while telling the story. He was calm, matter of fact, not just during the confession, but in the following days. It was as if he had emotionally detached from the crimes entirely. Experts in forensic psychology began weighing in. Chris Watts displayed classic signs of a narcissistic personality: charming, manipulative, and obsessed with his image. He wasn't just cheating on his wife. He was building a new identity, one where he was free from the responsibilities of fatherhood and family life. Shannon and the girls were obstacles to that fantasy, and so he eliminated them. Digital evidence further supported this narrative. Texts and Google searches showed Chris researching how to start a new life with Nicole Kessinger. He was looking up real estate, vacation spots, and even engagement rings. He wasn't mourning. He was planning. In court, Chris ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty. Shannon's family, devastated and shattered, asked the court to spare his life, not out of mercy for Chris, but to ensure he lived every day with what he'd done. At sentencing, Shannon's parents spoke through tears. "We trusted you," her father said. "You disgust me. You carried them out like trash." The courtroom was silent except for quiet sobbing. The judge, visibly emotional, called the murders the most inhumane and vicious crime I've handled. Chris was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for unlawful termination of a pregnancy and tampering with a dead body. He was transferred to a maximum security prison out of state, reportedly for his own safety. The case captured global attention not only because of its brutality, but because it destroyed the illusion of the perfect family. The Wattses had smiling family photos, beautiful daughters, and a seemingly stable life. But beneath the surface, it was a lie. Chris had worn a mask so convincing that not even those closest to him saw what was coming. For many, the most haunting aspect wasn't just the murders. It was the calculated coldness behind them, the way he gave interviews, the way he acted around neighbors, the way he pretended to search. It was a performance, all while knowing the truth. The motive: Chris claimed he felt trapped, that he wanted to start over, that he was afraid of losing everything. But what he never seemed to grasp was that he destroyed everything by his own hand. The Watts family murders are a grim reminder of how appearances can be deceiving, and how darkness can exist behind even the most polished facades. The sentencing of Chris Watts didn't close the chapter on this tragedy. It only opened new ones. Across the country and around the world, people struggled to make sense of the brutality and deception. In homes, on podcasts, and in true crime documentaries, the question kept echoing: how could this happen? How could a father, husband, and seemingly normal man carry out such horrific acts with such cold precision? The media coverage was relentless. Within days of Chris's arrest, national networks had descended on Frederick, Colorado. The Watts house became a symbol of a broken American dream. Family portraits still hanging on the walls, a pink playroom untouched, a baby's nursery that would never be used. Drone footage and body cam videos were released, giving the public a closer look into the case than almost any other in recent memory. Netflix released a documentary in 2020 titled American Murder: The Family Next Door, using only real footage, texts, police cams, and home videos. It went viral. People were horrified not just by what happened, but by how familiar and ordinary everything seemed leading up to it. There were no obvious warning signs, no history of violence. The story's horror came from its invisibility. True crime communities and psychologists began to analyze Chris's personality. They studied his motivations, emotional detachment, and what his actions revealed about hidden rage and narcissism. He became a case study not only in criminal psychology, but also in how sociopaths can function undetected in everyday life. Shannon's story, however, became just as central to the narrative. She was not simply a backdrop to a crime. She was a woman with dreams, health challenges, and a drive to build a stable life for her children. Her videos, once cheerful Facebook posts, now stood as both testimony and tragedy. She became a face for thousands of women whose warning signs go unseen. As interest in the case grew, so did the conspiracies. Shockingly, Shannon's family became targets of online harassment. Fringe theorists accused them of staging the crime, faking the deaths, or being complicit. These false claims, amplified by YouTube channels and blogs, pushed the Rzusek family into a second wave of trauma. They eventually filed lawsuits to stop the defamation, and they spoke out publicly about the damage caused, not only by Chris, but by strangers obsessed with twisting the truth into entertainment. Meanwhile, Chris began receiving fan mail in prison. Some letters came from people expressing sympathy. Others came from women who claimed to love him. It was a disturbing trend, one seen before with other infamous killers. But in this case, it felt even more unsettling. Chris had murdered his own children, and still, some saw him as a figure worth romanticizing. To many, this revealed a deeper problem with how society consumes true crime: the tendency to idolize the perpetrator instead of remembering the victims. Law enforcement, too, reflected on what the case exposed. Investigators credited the early release of body cam footage and home surveillance for helping build public trust and speeding up the timeline of justice. The transparency in the investigation became a model for other departments across the country. The case also sparked discussions on domestic violence, particularly non-physical abuse. Advocates called for more education around psychological manipulation, emotional control, and warning signs in seemingly normal relationships. By the time Chris was sentenced to multiple life terms, he had been completely socially exiled. While he claimed to have found religion behind bars, most viewed his statements as hollow, especially when compared to the weight of his actions. The Watts home, now stripped of its former life, became a dark landmark in Frederick. Neighbors avoided the block. Some moved away. Others said the house never stopped feeling heavy. It stood as a physical reminder of a smiling portrait turned horror story. For millions who followed the case, the impact remains. Chris Watts became the face of deception, a reminder that evil can wear khakis and a polo shirt, that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they host backyard BBQs. But the legacy of the Watts case isn't just about him. It's about Shannon, Bella, Celeste, Nico. Their names are remembered, their stories retold, not because they were taken, but because they lived, and because the world refuses to let them be forgotten. The story of Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico Watts continues to echo far beyond the confines of Frederick, Colorado. Their names have become part of a conversation that extends into justice reform, domestic violence awareness, and the deep complexities of human psychology. What happened to them wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a reflection of something greater, something societal. In the wake of the murders, countless people began re-examining the idea of the perfect family. The Wattses appeared to be exactly that. Smiling in photos, active in their community, building a life together. But behind closed doors, a far darker reality had taken root. It reminded the world that appearances can be painfully deceiving. Shannan's presence lives on through her videos, shared widely in the wake of her death. Clips of her speaking about motherhood, positivity, and perseverance now carry new weight. They're not just memories, they're reminders. She was a woman trying to hold her family together, unaware of what was coming. That contrast, the joy in her voice versus the silence that followed, still haunts many who followed the case. The public's reaction to the case sparked necessary conversations, discussions about how society treats domestic abuse, especially when it's emotional or psychological rather than physical. Conversations about the red flags we overlook, the discomfort we ignore, the smiles we trust too easily. Many who followed the case said it changed how they view their relationships, their neighborhoods, their trust in the familiar. It reminded people that evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes, it sits at the dinner table. It wears a wedding ring. Shannan's family continues to advocate for awareness. In interviews, they focus not just on justice, but on prevention. They hope no one else has to suffer the way they did. They want the story of Shannan and the children to be more than a cautionary tale. They want it to be a catalyst. As for Chris Watts, his name is forever linked to betrayal. His story has been dissected, analyzed, and debated, but never forgiven. While he may have found a form of peace or redemption in prison, the public response suggests he will never truly be free. The magnitude of his actions is too great. The damage is irreversible. Yet, through the pain and the loss, something else emerged. A community of people who vowed to never forget, who shared Shannan's videos not just as tributes, but as rallying cries, who honored Bella and Celeste with murals and playground dedications, who turned heartbreak into action. The legacy of this case is complex. On one hand, it is a story of darkness, of unimaginable betrayal, of innocent lives lost. But on the other, it is also a story of light, of how people can come together to mourn, to support, to remember, of how a tragedy can become a movement, of how love, even in its absence, can leave behind an unbreakable imprint. In the end, the Watts case is not just about what was lost. It's about what we must protect, our empathy, our awareness, our willingness to speak out. It's about holding on to the memory of those we've lost and refusing to let their stories fade. So if you've made it to this point in the story, remember this: Shannan Watts was more than a victim. Bella and Celeste were more than statistics. Nico was more than a pregnancy announcement. They were a family, and their story will not be forgotten.